Good evening, tonight, as the sun sets somewhere far from here and the shadows grow long across civilized lands. I want you to close your eyes and imagine something rather unpleasant. You're about to wake up not in your comfortable bed, not in your climate-controlled room with its reliable plumbing and medical care within reasonable distance, no. You're about to wake up in the American wild, west of the 1870s, and before you start picturing yourself as some sharpshooting cowboy with a mysterious past and a perfectly weathered hat, let me stop you right there. You're not the hero of this story. You're not even the interesting side character. You're just another confused, sunburnt nobody who's probably about to be bitten by a rattlesnake, swindled out of your last coin by a card sharp with friendly eyes and nimble fingers, or shot dead over a heated disagreement involving the last serving of beans at the saloon. Welcome to your new reality. Smells like horse manure, tastes like dust, and feels like dying slowly under an indifferent sky. Before we continue this delightful journey into historical misery, why don't you drop a comment below and tell us what corner of the world you're watching from, and whether you're brave enough to admit what time it is right now. Are you supposed to be sleeping, working, pretending to pay attention in a meeting? This channel thrives on night owls, insomniacs, and people who've given up on having a normal sleep schedule, just like the poor souls we're about to meet. Chapter 1: The Awakening. You wake up, and immediately you know something is terribly wrong. The air tastes like copper and grit. Your mouth feels like it's been stuffed with cotton that's been left out in a sandstorm. And there's a sound you can't quite identify, something between a wheeze and a death rattle. Congratulations, that's you breathing. Your eyes crack open to reveal a canvas ceiling that's seen better decades, stained with what you desperately hope is just tobacco juice, but suspect might be something far worse. The smell hits you next, a symphony of unwashed bodies, horse sweat, rotting wood, and something that might generously be called food but bears no resemblance to anything you'd recognize as edible. You're lying on what passes for a bed in this God-forsaken place, a thin mattress stuffed with straw. That's probably home to more living creatures than you want to contemplate. Every muscle in your body aches as if you've been trampled by cattle, which, given where you are, is entirely possible. Your clothes, and the term is used loosely, here are stiff with dirt, sweat, and substances you don't want to identify. Welcome to Deadwood, Dakota Territory, 1876. Or maybe it's Tombstone, Arizona Territory, 1881. Hell, it could be any one of 1,000 nameless settlements scattered across the American frontier like discarded playing cards. The point is, you're here. And here is about as close to the edge of civilization as you can get without falling off entirely. The temperature outside is either blazing hot enough to fry an egg on a rock, or cold enough to freeze your spit before it hits the ground. There's no middle ground in this place. The weather exists in a perpetual state of trying to kill you. Just like everything else, you sit up and immediately regret it as your head feels like it's been split open with an axe. This could be from the altitude, the dehydration, the malnutrition, or the fact that you were drinking something last night that bore only a passing resemblance to actual alcohol. In frontier towns, whiskey was often a creative mixture of grain, alcohol, tobacco, juice, turpentine, and whatever else the bartender thought might give it color and bite. The fact that it didn't blind you is a small miracle. Your stomach churns, and you realize you're facing the first of many daily challenges: finding something to eat that won't kill you, and somewhere to relieve yourself that won't result in dysentery, cholera, or a snake bite in a very uncomfortable location. Chapter 2: The morning routine, or how to almost die before breakfast. You stumble outside, squinting against the assault of morning light, reflecting off dust that seems to hang in the air like a permanent fog. The street tanned, calling it a street is generous, a rutted mess of mud, horse manure, and discarded garbage that squelches under your boots with sounds that make your already queasy stomach perform somersaults. First order of business, water. Not because you're thirsty, though you are, desperately, but because without it, you'll be dead within days. The problem is finding water that won't kill you faster than dehydration would. The local well, if there is one, is likely contaminated, with everything from animal waste to human refuse to the occasional corpse that someone forgot to properly dispose of. You approach what passes for the town's water. Saucer wooden trough that's seen better decades. The water inside is brownish and has things floating in it that you choose not to examine too closely. This is your drinking water, your cooking water, your washing water if you're fortunate enough to wash, which most people aren't. The smart settlers boiled their water, but fuel was scarce and expensive. Wood had to be cut, hauled, and carefully rationed. Coal, when available, cost more than food. So most people took their chances with whatever water they could find, leading to regular outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and a dozen other diseases that turned frontier life into a game of biological Russian roulette. You fill your tin cuppers, assuming you own such luxury, and drink. The water tastes like it's been filtered through old boots and despair. Your stomach immediately protests, but you force it down because the alternative is dying of thirst, which, while quicker, is considerably more unpleasant. Next comes the morning ritual of assessing what hurts and why. Your back aches from sleeping on that straw mattress that doubled as a boarding house for insects. Your feet are blistered from boots that were never designed for the amount of walking frontier life demands. Your hands are cracked and bleeding from work, weather, and the general hostility of your environment. Speaking of work, you need to find some, and fast. In frontier towns, there were essentially two types of people: those who worked themselves to death, and those who died quickly from not working. There was no social safety net, no unemployment benefits, no pension plan. You worked, you ate. You didn't work, you starved. It was capitalism in its purest, most brutal form. Chapter 3: Employment Opportunities, or How to Choose. Your method of dying. Your employment options in this charming frontier settlement are limited, but varied in their potential for causing your untimely demise. Let's review your career prospects, shall we? Option 1. Cowboy. Forget everything the movies taught you about cowboys. You won't be riding off into romantic sunsets or engaging in noble gunfights with clearly defined good guys and bad guys. Real cowboys were mostly underpaid, overworked laborers who spent their days eating dust, getting kicked by ornery cattle, and trying not to die of exposure. A cowboy's day started before dawn and ended well after dark. Your job was to move cattle, massive, stupid, dangerous animals that were constantly trying to kill themselves, or you, preferably both. You'd ride for 12 to 16 hours a day in weather that ranged from blazing heat, that could literally cook your brain in your skull, to freezing cold that turned your hands into useless clubs of frozen meat. The pay was roughly $30 a month, when you got paid at all. Many ranchers were creative with their bookkeeping, finding ways to charge cowboys for their food, lodging, and equipment until the debt exceeded their wages. Congratulations, you're now an indentured servant with spurs, and those romantic cattle drives you've seen in movies. Picture this instead: weeks or months of eating beans, breathing dust, sleeping on the ground, and dealing with cattle that were determined to scatter in every direction except the one you wanted them to go. Rivers had to be crossed, storms had to be weathered, and rustlers had to be dealt with, usually by shooting them. Because the legal system was still a few decades away from reaching most of the frontier. Option 2, Prospector, the Gold Rush. Sounds exciting until you realize that for every person who struck it rich, thousands died broken, and forgotten. Gold prospecting was essentially gambling with your life as the stakes. You'd spend your days bent over a pan or crouched in a hole in the ground, sifting through tons of dirt and gravel in the hope of finding a few flakes of precious metal. Your back would ache, your hands would bleed, and your dreams would slowly die as you realized that the stories of easy wealth were largely fiction spread by merchants who were making their fortunes selling supplies to hopeful prospectors. The real money in gold rushes wasn't in finding gold, was in selling picks, shovels, food, and other necessities to the miners at inflated prices. By the time you arrived at any gold rush location, the easy pickings were long gone, claimed by earlier arrivals who were now either rich or dead. Most prospectors lived in conditions that made prison camps look luxurious. They slept in tents or crude shelters, ate whatever they could afford or catch, and drank water that was often contaminated with mercury and other chemicals used in the mining process. Disease ran rampant through mining camps, and medical care was non-existent. Option 3, shopkeeper running a store, might seem like a safer option. But frontier commerce was a dangerous game. You'd need capital to stock your store, which most people didn't have. You'd need to extend credit to customers who might never pay, because cash was scarce and many transactions were conducted through barter or promises. Your store would be a target for robbers, both the professional kind and the desperate kind. Insurance didn't exist, and law enforcement was either absent or ineffective. If someone robbed you, you might get your goods back if you were lucky enough to catch the thieves and strong enough to take the goods back by force. Your inventory would be limited to whatever could survive the journey to your frontier outpost. Fresh goods were rare and expensive. Most of what you sold would be canned, dried, or preserved in ways that barely qualified as food. You'd sell medicine that was mostly alcohol and hope, tools that were made as cheaply as possible, and clothing that was designed to last just long enough for the customer to get out of sight. Option 4, saloon worker saloons were the social centers of frontier towns, which tells you everything you need to know about frontier social life. Working in a saloon meant dealing with drunks, gamblers, prostitutes, and men with guns who had very little to lose and even less impulse control. Bartenders were part server, part referee, part undertaker. You'd serve alcohol that was barely fit for cleaning wounds to men who were armed and had spent their days doing back-breaking labor under impossible conditions. Fights were common, shootings were regular, and cleanup was always your responsibility. The hours were long, the pay was uncertain, and the life expectancy was short. Many saloon workers doubled as undertakers, because somebody had to clean up after the inevitable violence, and it might as well be the person who was already used to dealing with human misery. Chapter 4, The Daily Grind, or How Everything You Do Might Kill You. Let's assume you've found employment that hasn't killed you, yet no small accomplishment. Now comes the challenge of actually living through a typical day without dying from any of the countless hazards that frontier life throws at you with the enthusiasm of a drunk cowboy with a loaded gun. Your workday starts before sunrise, because daylight was precious and artificial lighting was expensive, dangerous, or both. Candles were costly and prone to starting fires that could burn down entire towns in minutes. Oil lamps were better, but still risky, and the oil was often of questionable quality. Most people simply worked by natural light and went to bed when the sun set, because the alternative was risking death by fire. The work itself was physical, dangerous, and relentless. Whether you were handling livestock, working in mines, building structures, or running a business, every task carried the potential for serious injury or death. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no OSHA inspectors. If you were injured on the job, you were on your own. Medical care, when available, was primitive at best and often more dangerous than the original injury. Most frontier doctors had little formal training and relied on treatments that would horrify modern medical professionals. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics were unknown, and the most common medical advice was to drink more alcohol and hope for the best. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. A broken bone could cripple you for life. A fever could burn through an entire town, leaving dozens dead and no one with any real understanding of why. People died from diseases that are easily treatable today, and they died from accidents that would be minor inconveniences in our modern world. The physical demands of frontier life aged people rapidly. Men and women in their 30s looked like they were in their 50s, assuming they lived that long. The combination of poor nutrition, hard labor, exposure to the elements, and constant stress took a devastating toll on the human body. Your hands would be permanently stained with dirt, grease, and blood. Your face would be weathered and scarred by sun, wind, and flying debris. Your back would ache constantly from bending, lifting, and carrying loads that would challenge a pack animal. Your feet would be blistered and deformed by ill-fitting boots and endless walking on rough terrain, and through it all, you'd be hungry. Frontier food was scarce, expensive, and often spoiled. A good meal was a luxury that most people experienced rarely. The standard diet consisted of beans, hardtack, jerky, and whatever could be hunted, trapped, or gathered from the hostile environment. Chapter 5: The Cuisine, or How to Starve on a Full Stomach. Speaking of food, let's discuss what passes for cuisine in your new frontier home. Prepare yourself for a culinary adventure that will make you appreciate every meal you've ever complained about. Beans. Let's start with beans, because you'll be eating a lot of them. Beans for breakfast, beans for lunch, beans for dinner. Beans that have been cooked until they're mushy. Beans that are still hard enough to break teeth. Beans that have been sitting in pots for days, accumulating flavors that are best not contemplated too deeply. The beans themselves are often of questionable quality, old, tough, and sometimes infested with weevils and other insects that add protein whether you want it or not. They're cooked in water that's already suspect, seasoned with salt that's been contaminated with everything from sand to animal droppings, and served in bowls that haven't been properly cleaned since the previous century. Hardtack, or ship's biscuit, was the other staple of frontier dining. These were hard, dry crackers that could last for years without spoiling, mainly because they were already so preserved that bacteria couldn't find anything to feed on. They were so hard that they had to be soaked in coffee or water before eating, and even then they could break teeth or lacerate gums. Smart travelers would tap their hardtack before eating to shake out the weevils. But most people eventually gave up and just ate the extra protein. After all, weevils were probably cleaner than most of the other things going into frontier food. Coffee was available, but calling it coffee was an act of optimism. It was usually made from beans that had been roasted until they were charcoal, ground with whatever was available, and brewed in pots that were never properly cleaned. The result was a bitter, gritty liquid that bore only a passing resemblance to actual coffee but contained enough caffeine to keep you awake through the various horrors of frontier life. When coffee beans weren't available, people made coffee from chicory, dandelion roots, acorns, or whatever else they thought might produce a hot, dark liquid. The results were universally awful, but they were hot and wet, which was better than nothing. Meat was available when animals could be hunted, trapped, or slaughtered, but preservation was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly, salted, smoked, or dried into jerky. Most of it was tough, salty, and often partially spoiled by the time it was consumed. Fresh meat was a luxury that carried its own risks. Butchering was done under primitive conditions with minimal understanding of sanitation. The meat might be contaminated with bacteria, parasites, or diseases that could kill you. But when you're hungry enough, you eat what's available and hope for the best. Vegetables were rare and precious. Most frontier settlements were too new, too harsh, or too temporary to support gardens. What vegetables were available were usually dried, canned, or pickled beyond recognition. Fresh vegetables were so rare that they were sometimes worth more than gold, and their absence led to scurvy, rickets, and other nutritional diseases that could cripple or kill. Water, as we've discussed, was often contaminated, but it was mixed with alcohol whenever possible. Not because people were particularly fond of drinking, but because alcohol killed some of the bacteria that made water dangerous. Beer and whiskey were often safer to drink than water, which led to a frontier culture where being slightly drunk was the healthiest option. Milk was available when cows were available, but pasteurization hadn't been invented yet. Fresh milk could contain tuberculosis, brucellosis, and a dozen other diseases. Most people avoided it unless they were desperate, which was often. Meals were cooked over open fires or on wood-burning stoves that were temperamental at best. Temperature control was impossible, fuel was expensive, and fires had to be constantly tended to prevent them from going out or burning down the building. Most food was either burned on the outside and raw on the inside, or cooked until it was uniform mush. Eating. Utensils were scarce and often shared among multiple people without washing between users. Plates and bowls were cleaned with sand or ash, if they were cleaned at all. Most people ate with their hands or with knives that doubled as tools, weapons, and eating implements. Food poisoning was common and often fatal. There was no understanding of bacteria, no knowledge of safe food handling, and no way to treat the resulting illness. People died regularly from eating food that had spoiled, been contaminated, or been improperly prepared. And yet, somehow, people survived on this diet. They were chronically malnourished, often sick, and constantly hungry, but they survived. The human body's ability to adapt to terrible conditions is both impressive and depressing. Chapter 6. Personal hygiene, or how to smell like death and look worse. Now that we've covered what you'll be putting into your body, let's discuss the condition of the body itself. Personal hygiene in the American frontier was less of a routine and more of an occasional, desperate attempt to remove the most offensive layers of accumulated filth. Bathing was rare, difficult, and often dangerous. Water had to be hauled, heated, and carefully rationed. A full bath required enormous amounts of water and fuel, both of which were precious commodities. Most people made do with occasional washing of hands, face, and other parts that couldn't be avoided. When bathing did occur, it was usually a communal affair. The same tub of water would be used by multiple people, starting with the head of the household and working down through family members and guests in order of importance. By the time the last person bathed, the water was more dirt than liquid, and the bather was likely dirtier coming out than going in. Soap was expensive and often homemade from animal fat and lye. The resulting product was harsh, caustic, and barely effective. It could remove some dirt, but it also removed skin, hair, and anything else it came into contact with. Many people preferred to stay dirty rather than endure the pain of frontier. Soap hair washing was even rarer than bathing. Most people's hair was permanently stiff with grease, dust, and various unidentifiable substances. Lice were universal, and the only treatment was to cut the hair short or shave it off entirely. Many frontier women kept their hair covered, not for modesty, but to hide the fact that they had little or no hair left. Dental hygiene was non-existent. Toothbrushes were unknown, toothpaste hadn't been invented, and dental care consisted of pulling teeth when they became too painful to endure. Most adults had lost multiple teeth by their 20s, and those that remained were often black, broken, or infected. The result was breath that could kill small animals, and smiles that were more frightening than appealing. People learned to speak and eat around missing teeth, and dental pain was simply accepted as part of life. Clothing was worn until it literally fell apart. Most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, which were worn continuously for weeks or months without washing. Washing clothes required water, soap, time, and fuel, all of which were in short supply. When clothes were washed, it was a major undertaking that required an entire day. Clothes had to be boiled, scrubbed, rinsed, and dried, all while hoping that the harsh treatment wouldn't destroy the fabric. Many garments didn't survive the washing process, leaving people with even fewer clothing options. Underwear was often non-existent or consisted of rough, scratchy fabric that caused more problems than it solved. Most people went without, which added to the general discomfort and hygiene challenges of frontier life. Deodorant hadn't been invented, and perfume was expensive and rare. People simply smelled like whatever they'd been doing, which was usually unpleasant. The smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and various bodily functions was so universal that it became background noise. Women faced additional challenges with menstruation. Sanitary products didn't exist, and women had to make do with rags, moss, or whatever else they could find. These materials were often reused without proper cleaning, leading to infections and other health problems. Shaving was done with straight razors that were often dull, dirty, and dangerous. Many men simply grew beards to avoid the risk of cutting their throats while shaving. Those who did shave often ended up with cuts, infections, and scars that marked them as survivors of frontier grooming. The overall effect was a population that looked and smelled like they'd been living in a barn for months, which was often literally true. Personal appearance was a luxury that few could afford, and survival took precedence over vanity. And yet, people adapted to these conditions and found ways to maintain some sense of dignity and self-respect. They learned to ignore the smell, overlook the appearance, and focus on more immediate concerns like staying alive. Chapter 7: Social Life and Entertainment, or How to Have Fun While Dying. After a long day of nearly dying from work, bad food, and poor hygiene, you might think it's time to relax and enjoy some entertainment. In frontier towns, entertainment was indeed available. but it came with its own unique set of hazards and moral complications. The saloon was the social center of most frontier communities, and it was where you'd go to drink, gamble, fight, and occasionally get shot. These establishments were part bar, part casino, part brothel, and part funeral home, often serving all functions simultaneously. Walking into a frontier saloon was like entering a cloud of tobacco smoke, body odor, spilled alcohol, and various other substances that were best not identified too closely. The floor was covered with sawdust that was supposed to absorb spills, but mainly served to hide the blood, vomit, and other fluids that accumulated during the course of an evening. The clientele was a mixture of cowboys, miners, gamblers, outlaws, and other men who'd been pushed to the edges of civilization by circumstances, choice, or outstanding warrants. They were armed, drunk, broke, and often looking for someone to blame for their various misfortunes. Conversations were loud, arguments were frequent, and violence was always just one wrong word away. Gambling was the primary form of entertainment, and it was completely unregulated. Professional gamblers moved from town to town, setting up games that were rigged in their favor and counting on the desperation and poor judgment of their marks to make their living. Card games were conducted with marked decks, loaded dice, and rules that changed depending on who was winning. Getting caught cheating was often a death sentence, but so was losing too much money to the wrong person. Many disputes over gambling. Debts were settled with guns, knives, or bare hands, and the results were rarely in doubt. The house always won, and the house was usually armed. Dancing was available, but the dance partners were professional women who were paid by the dance and often provided additional services for additional fees. These women lived hard lives in dangerous conditions, subject to violence, disease, and social ostracism. They were among the few women in frontier towns, which made them valuable but also vulnerable. Music was provided by whoever could play an instrument and was sober enough to keep time. The songs were usually bawdy, depressing, or both, reflecting the harsh realities of frontier life. A good musician could make decent money, but they had to be tough enough to survive the environment and diplomatic enough to avoid getting shot for playing the wrong song at the wrong time. Other forms of entertainment included bare-knuckle boxing, dogfighting, and various contests of strength or skill that usually ended with someone getting seriously injured. Audiences bet on the outcomes, and violence was considered part of the show. Public executions were major social events that drew crowds from miles around. Hangings were conducted with great ceremony, and vendors sold food and drink to the spectators. It was entertainment, justice, and social control all rolled into one grim spectacle. Horse racing was popular when horses were available and the ground was suitable. Races were informal affairs with betting that could get out of hand quickly. Disputes over race results were common and often violent. Theater groups occasionally passed through frontier towns, but their performances were usually interrupted by drunk or disorderly audience members. The actors had to be prepared for heckling, violence, and the possibility that they might have to defend themselves physically during their performances. Reading was limited to whatever books, newspapers, or other printed materials could make. The journey to frontier towns. Most reading material was months old by the time it arrived, and it was read and reread until it fell apart. Literacy was not universal, so those who could read often found themselves reading aloud to groups of listeners. Social gatherings were rare and usually centered around religious services, community work projects, or responses to crises. People were too busy surviving to have much time for socializing, and the harsh conditions didn't encourage the kind of leisurely social interactions that characterized more settled communities. Romance was complicated by the scarcity of women, the harsh living conditions, and the general uncertainty of frontier life. Courtship was often brief and practical, focused more on survival partnership than romantic love. Marriage was frequently a business arrangement designed to improve the chances of both parties, surviving long enough to establish a stable life, children's. Entertainment consisted mainly of work, as children were expected to contribute to the family's survival from an early age. Games and toys were luxuries that few families could afford, and childhood was often cut short by the demands of frontier life. Chapter 8: Law and Order, or How Justice Works When There Are No Rules. The concept of law and order in frontier towns was flexible, creative, and often administered at the end of a rope. Forget everything you think you know about frontier justice from movies and television. The reality was far more chaotic, arbitrary, and brutal. Most frontier settlements had no formal legal system, no trained law enforcement, and no established courts. Justice was administered by whoever had the most guns, the most friends, or the most convincing argument. The result was a system where might made right, and the definition of right changed depending on who was doing the defining. Sheriffs, when they existed, were often elected by popular vote, appointed by local business interests, or simply declared themselves to be in charge and dared anyone to disagree. Their qualifications were usually limited to being good with a gun and willing to risk their lives for very little pay. Many sheriffs were former outlaws who decided that law enforcement offered better job security than crime, which wasn't always true. The badge was often the only thing that distinguished a sheriff from the criminals he was supposed to arrest. Many lawmen were corrupt, violent, or incompetent, and some were all three. They made their own rules, enforced them selectively, and often had financial interests in the businesses they were supposed to regulate. Jails were crude affairs, usually consisting of a room with bars on the windows and a lock on the door. Prisoners were expected to provide their own food, blankets, and other necessities, and those who couldn't afford these luxuries often didn't survive their incarceration. Escape was common, partly because the jails were poorly constructed, and partly because guards were often drunk, absent, or sympathetic to the prisoners' trials. When they occurred, were informal proceedings conducted by whoever was available and willing to serve as judge. Legal training was not required, and many judges made up the law as they went along. Juries were selected from whoever happened to be in town and sober enough to sit upright, and their decisions were often influenced more by personal relationships and bribes than by evidence or testimony. The death penalty was common and was administered for crimes that would be considered minor misdemeanors today. Horse theft was a hanging offense, as was cattle rustling, murder, rape, and sometimes just being unpopular. Executions were carried out quickly, often within days or hours of the trial, and were considered public entertainment. Lynching was an alternative to formal justice that was often preferred by communities that didn't want to wait for trials or weren't confident in the legal system. Mobs would form spontaneously, seize suspected criminals, and administer their own version of justice. The accused rarely survived these encounters, and guilt or innocence was often irrelevant. Vigilante committees were organized groups of citizens who took law enforcement into their own hands. They operated outside the legal system, set their own rules, and enforced them with whatever means they deemed necessary. Some vigilante committees were relatively fair and effective, but others were essentially organized criminal enterprises that used the pretense of law and order to settle personal scores and advance their own interests. Gunfights were less common than popular culture suggests, but when they occurred, they were usually quick, brutal, and decisive. The romantic notion of two men facing each other in the street at high noon was largely fictional. Real gunfights were more likely to involve ambushes, shooting from cover, or simply walking up behind someone and pulling the trigger. Professional gunfighters were rare, but they did exist. These were men who made their living with their guns, either as hired killers, bodyguards, or law enforcement officers. They were skilled, dangerous, and usually short-lived. The nature of their profession meant that they were constantly making enemies, and it was only a matter of time before they met someone faster, luckier, or more ruthless. Most violence was spontaneous and alcohol-fueled. Men who'd been drinking, gambling, or working under harsh conditions would get into arguments that escalated quickly to physical confrontation. Knives were more common than guns in these fights, and the results were often messy and fatal. Women had few legal rights and little protection under frontier law. They couldn't vote, serve on juries, or testify in court in many jurisdictions. Domestic violence was considered a private matter, and rape was difficult to prosecute and often resulted in the victim being blamed or ostracized. Property rights were often determined by possession and the ability to defend what you claimed. Land ownership was frequently disputed, and these disputes were settled by force as often as by law. Claim jumping was common in mining areas, and the original claimant often had to fight to keep what he'd legally claimed. Contracts were difficult to enforce, and many business disputes were settled through violence or the threat of violence. A man's word was supposed to be his bond, but there were plenty of men whose word wasn't worth the breath it took to speak it. The result was a society where personal survival depended more on individual strength, cunning, and alliances than on institutional protections. Justice was arbitrary, punishment was swift and often fatal, and the line between law enforcement and criminality was often invisible. Chapter 9. The Reality of Gun Culture, or How to Die Slowly from a Bullet Wound. Let's address the elephant in the room more rather. The Colt .45 on everyone's hip. The mythology of the American West is inseparable from firearms, but the reality of gun culture in frontier America was quite different from what Hollywood would have you believe. First, let's talk about the guns themselves. The iconic Colt single. Action, Army, Revolver, the Peacemaker, wasn't introduced until 1873, and it was expensive. Most people carried whatever firearm they could afford, which was often a capandable revolver, a single-shot pistol, or nothing at all. Quality varied wildly, and many guns were as dangerous to the person holding them as to their intended target. Loading a gun was a time-consuming process that required black powder, wadding, and lead balls or cartridges that had to be loaded individually. Into each chamber, a skilled shooter could load 6 rounds in about 2 minutes, assuming he had all the necessary materials and his hands weren't shaking from cold, fear, or alcohol. In a life or death situation, 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours. Accuracy was another problem entirely. These were not precision instruments. The effective range of most handguns was maybe 25 yards, and that's if you were a good shot with a well-maintained weapon. Most frontier guns were neither well-maintained nor accurately zeroed, and most shooters were not particularly skilled marksmen. The famous quick-draw duels were largely mythical. Drawing and firing quickly usually meant missing your target entirely, and most sensible people preferred to take their time and aim carefully. The gunfighter who lived longest was usually the one who shot first from cover, not the one who could draw fastest. Ammunition was expensive and often unreliable. Cartridges could misfire, fail to fire at all, or explode in the gun barrel, potentially maiming or killing the shooter. Many people carried guns that they couldn't afford to shoot for practice, which meant that when they needed to use them, they were essentially firing blind. Maintenance was crucial and often neglected. Guns had to be cleaned regularly to prevent corrosion and jamming, but cleaning supplies were expensive and not always available. A dirty gun was more likely to misfire, jam, or explode. But many people carried dirty guns because they had no choice. When someone was shot, the wound was usually fatal, but death was often slow and agonizing. Medical treatment was primitive, antibiotics didn't exist, and most gunshot wounds became infected. Even a minor wound could lead to gangrene, blood poisoning, and death. Many gunshot victims survived the initial shooting only to die days or weeks later from infection. The .45 caliber bullet was indeed powerful, but it was also slow-moving by modern standards. It could cause massive tissue damage and break bones, but it didn't always kill immediately. Many shooting victims lived long enough to shoot back, leading to mutual destruction that left multiple corpses and no clear winner. Most people who carried guns never used them in anger. The gun was a tool, like a hammer or a knife, and it was used for hunting, pest control, and intimidation more than for actual combat. The mere presence of a gun could end an argument before it started, which was often preferable to actually using it. Professional gunfighters were rare and usually didn't live long enough to become legendary. The men who survived were those who avoided fair fights, shot from ambush, and made sure their opponents were dead before they hit the ground. Chivalry was a luxury that few could afford in a world where hesitation meant death. Many gun deaths were accidents. Guns went off while being cleaned, dropped, or handled carelessly. Children found loaded weapons and shot themselves or others. Drunk men fumbled with firearms and killed friends, family members, or innocent bystanders. For every intentional shooting, there were probably several accidental ones. The sound of gunfire was common in frontier towns, but it didn't always mean violence. Guns were fired to signal danger, celebrate good news, or simply because someone was drunk and thought it would be fun. People became accustomed to the sound and often didn't bother to investigate unless the shooting went on for an unusually long time. Women sometimes carried small derringers or pepperbox pistols for protection, but these weapons were notoriously inaccurate and often failed to fire when needed. Many women relied more on knives, hatpins, or other improvised weapons that were more reliable at close range. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted about 30 seconds and involved more than 30 shots fired at close range. Only 3 men died, which tells you something about the accuracy of frontier firearms and the men who used them. Most of the participants were wounded, and the fight was over almost before it started. Gun laws existed in many frontier towns, but they were inconsistently enforced. Some towns required visitors to surrender their weapons to the sheriff upon arrival, while others encouraged everyone to go armed at all times. The laws changed frequently and were often ignored by both citizens and law enforcement. Chapter 10: Disease and Medicine, or How to Die from a Splinter. Now that we've covered how you might die violently, let's discuss the more common ways frontier life could kill you. Disease. Infection. and medical treatment that was often worse than the original problem. Medicine in the American frontier was a combination of folk remedies, educated guesswork, and desperate hope. Doctors were scarce, expensive, and often more dangerous than helpful. Many had little or no formal training, and those who did have medical education were working with knowledge that was decades behind the scientific understanding of their time. The concept of germs and infection was not widely understood or accepted. Most people believed that disease was caused by bad air, moral failing, or supernatural forces. This led to treatments that were not only ineffective, but often harmful. Bloodletting was still common, based on the theory that disease could be drained out of the body along with the blood. A simple cut or scrape could become infected and kill you within days. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and little understanding of wound care. Injuries were often treated with whatever was available: dirt, saliva, alcohol, or nothing at all. Gangrene was common, and the usual treatment was amputation with a saw, performed without anesthesia, while the patient was held down by several strong men. Surgery was a last resort that few patients survived. Operations were performed on kitchen tables or whatever flat surface was available, with instruments that were rarely sterilized. The surgeon's hands were unwashed, his clothes were dirty, and the operating environment was contaminated with everything from dust to animal droppings. Anesthesia was available in the form of alcohol, opium, or chloroform, but it was expensive and dangerous. Many patients died from the anesthesia rather than from the surgery itself. Most operations were performed on conscious patients, who were simply held down until the procedure was complete. Dental work was even more primitive than general surgery. Teeth were extracted with pliers by whoever was brave enough to try, usually without any form of pain relief. Many people preferred to live with the pain rather than risk the extraction, which could lead to massive bleeding, infection, or death from shock. Common diseases that are easily treatable today were often fatal in frontier conditions. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid, cholera, and dozens of other illnesses swept through frontier communities with devastating regularity. Without understanding the causes or transmission methods, people were helpless to prevent or treat these outbreaks. Smallpox was particularly feared because it was highly contagious and often fatal. Vaccination was available, but not widely trusted or practiced. Many people preferred to take their chances with the disease, rather than submit to a medical procedure they didn't understand. Malaria was common in areas with standing water, but the connection between mosquitoes and the disease was not understood. People attributed malaria to bad air from swamps and tried to treat it with various tonics and potions that were usually more alcohol than medicine. Dysentery was endemic in frontier communities due to poor sanitation and contaminated water supplies. It caused severe dehydration and could kill within days, especially in children and elderly people. The usual treatment was to give the patient more of the same contaminated water that had caused the problem in the first place. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mother and child. Many women died in labor or from complications in the days following delivery. Infant mortality was so high that parents often didn't name their children until they were old enough to have a reasonable chance of survival. Midwives provided most obstetric care, and their knowledge was based on tradition and experience rather than medical training. They did their best with limited resources, but they were helpless against serious complications like breech birth, hemorrhaging, or infection. Mental illness was poorly understood and often attributed to moral weakness or demonic possession. Treatment consisted of restraint, isolation, or various forms of punishment designed to drive out the evil spirits. Many mentally ill people were simply abandoned or driven out of communities to fend for themselves. Patent medicines were widely available and promised to cure everything from baldness to consumption. Most of these tonics contained alcohol, opium, or other substances that provided temporary relief from symptoms without addressing the underlying condition. They were expensive, addictive, and often more harmful than helpful. Veterinary medicine was sometimes more advanced than human medicine, because animals represented valuable economic assets that owners couldn't afford to lose. Horses and cattle received better medical care than many people, and some human ailments were treated with remedies originally developed for livestock. The average life expectancy in frontier communities was decades shorter than in more settled areas. People aged rapidly under the harsh conditions, and those who survived to old age were considered remarkable. Many people died in their 20s or 30s from diseases, accidents, or violence that would be preventable today. Chapter 11. Women on the Frontier, or How to Survive When Survival Wasn't Designed for You. The romanticized vision of frontier women as strong, independent pioneers barely scratches the surface of the brutal reality these women faced daily. If frontier life was hard for men, it was exponentially harder for women, who dealt with all the same dangers while facing additional challenges that could make survival nearly impossible. Women were drastically outnumbered in most frontier settlements, sometimes by ratios of 10 or 20 to 1. This scarcity made them valuable as potential wives, workers, and companions, but it also made them vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and unwanted attention from desperate men who hadn't seen a woman in months or years. Marriage was often less about love and more about survival. Partnership. Women married men they barely knew because the alternative was trying to survive alone in an environment that was hostile to solitary individuals of any gender. These marriages were frequently arranged quickly, sometimes within days of meeting, because practical considerations outweighed romantic ones. Domestic work in frontier conditions was back-breaking labor that never ended. Women were expected to cook, clean, wash clothes, tend gardens, care for children, and often help with whatever work their husbands were doing, all while dealing with primitive tools, scarce supplies, and harsh conditions that made every task exponentially more difficult. Cooking meant building and maintaining fires, hauling water, preparing food that was often spoiled or of poor quality, and creating meals from whatever ingredients were available. A simple dinner required hours of preparation and constant attention to prevent fires, burns, or food poisoning. Washing clothes was a day-long ordeal that involved hauling water, heating it over fires, scrubbing garments by hand with harsh soap, rinsing them multiple times, and hanging them to dry in weather that might freeze them solid or blow them away. Many women's hands were permanently damaged by the harsh chemicals and rough work required for laundry. Childbirth and childcare were enormous challenges in frontier conditions. Pregnant women continued working until labor began, often giving birth with only the assistance of other women who had no medical training. Many women died in childbirth, and those who survived faced the challenge of raising children in an environment where infant mortality was tragically high. Children required constant supervision to prevent them from being injured by animals, machinery, natural hazards, or the dozens of other dangers that surrounded frontier communities. Women were expected to keep their children safe, while simultaneously managing all their other responsibilities. Education for children was often the woman's responsibility, but few women had received much education themselves, and teaching materials were virtually non-existent. Many frontier children grew up illiterate because their mothers lacked the knowledge or resources to teach them. Medical care for women was particularly limited. Female-specific health issues were poorly understood and rarely discussed. Menstruation, pregnancy complications, and gynecological problems were handled with folk remedies and desperate improvisation. Many women suffered in silence rather than discuss their health problems with male doctors or untrained midwives. Women's legal rights were extremely limited. They couldn't vote, own property in their own names, or make legal contracts. If their husbands died, they often lost everything and had few options for supporting themselves and their children. Single women faced particular challenges. They were viewed with suspicion by communities that expected women to be married and under male protection. Finding work was difficult, as most jobs were considered unsuitable for women or were simply not available to them. The few jobs available to women were often dangerous or degrading. Some women worked as seamstresses or cooks, but the pay was minimal and the conditions were harsh. Others turned to prostitution, which was dangerous but sometimes the only way to earn enough money to survive. Women in frontier towns were often isolated from other women and had little social support. The loneliness could be overwhelming, especially for women who had come from more settled areas where they had family and friends. Many women suffered from what would now be recognized as depression, but mental health was not understood or treated. Violence against women was common and rarely punished. Domestic violence was considered a private matter, and women had little recourse against abusive husbands. Sexual assault was difficult to prosecute and often resulted in the victim being blamed or shamed. Despite all these challenges, many women not only survived but played crucial roles in establishing and maintaining frontier communities. They started schools, organized churches, provided medical care, and created the social institutions that transformed wild settlements into actual towns. Some women found unexpected freedom in frontier conditions. The shortage of workers meant that gender roles were sometimes more flexible, and women might find themselves doing work that would have been forbidden in more traditional settings. A few women even disguised themselves as men to gain access to better jobs and more freedom. The women who survived and thrived on the frontier were remarkably strong, resourceful, and adaptable. They learned to make do with almost nothing, to improvise solutions to impossible problems, and to endure hardships that would have broken many people. Their stories are often overlooked in favor of tales about gunfighters and outlaws, but they were the backbone of frontier society. Chapter 12: The Economics of Survival, or How to Go Broke While Working Yourself to Death. Money in the frontier economy was scarce, unpredictable, and often worthless. The romantic notion of striking it rich in the Wild West was contradicted by the harsh reality that most people worked themselves into. Early graves while remaining desperately poor. Cash was rare in frontier communities. Most transactions were conducted through barter, credit, or promises to pay later. A cowboy might work for months without seeing actual money, being paid instead with room, board, and the promise of wages that might never materialize. Many employers were creative with their bookkeeping, finding ways to charge workers for equipment, food, and lodging until their debts exceeded their earnings. The cost of basic necessities was astronomical compared to wages. A simple meal at A frontier restaurant might cost a full day's wages, and that meal would consist of beans, hardtack, and coffee that bore only a passing resemblance to actual food. A decent pair of boots could cost a month's salary, assuming you could find boots that fit, and were actually made of leather rather than cardboard, and hope transportation costs were enormous. Moving goods across vast distances on primitive roads, with unreliable transportation, meant that everything was expensive by the time it reached frontier communities. A can of peaches that cost pennies in Chicago might sell for several dollars in a mining camp, assuming it arrived without spoiling or being stolen en route. Banking was primitive and often crooked. Many frontier banks were fly-by-night operations, run by men with more enthusiasm than honesty. Bank failures were common, and depositors often lost everything when banks collapsed, were robbed, or simply disappeared in the middle of the night with all the deposits. Credit was available but dangerous. Interest rates were high, terms were often predatory, and defaulting on a loan could result in violence rather than legal proceedings. Many people found themselves trapped in cycles of debt that they could never escape, working constantly just to pay the interest on money they'd borrowed to survive. Mining was presented as a path to wealth, but the reality was that most miners died broke. The cost of equipment, supplies, and claims often exceeded any gold or silver that was found. Professional miners worked for wages that barely covered their expenses, while independent prospectors usually ended up deeper in debt with each passing month. Cattle ranching required enormous initial investments and years of work before showing any profit. Most small ranchers were constantly on the edge of bankruptcy, vulnerable to droughts, disease, market fluctuations, and rustlers who could wipe out years of work in a single night. Farming was even more precarious than ranching. Frontier agriculture was a gamble against weather, insects, plant diseases, and market conditions that were beyond the farmer's control. A single bad season could destroy a family's entire investment and leave them with nothing but debt and worthless. Land. Business ownership was risky and often short-lived. Stores, saloons, and other enterprises faced constant threats from robbery, fire, economic downturns, and changes in local conditions that could eliminate their customer base overnight. Many business owners worked 18-hour days just to stay afloat, and most eventually failed despite their best efforts. The economic system was designed to benefit suppliers and middlemen rather than producers and workers. The people who sold equipment to miners, supplies to ranchers, and goods to settlers often made more money than the people who actually did the work. It was safer and more profitable to sell shovels to gold miners than to mine for gold yourself. Women had even fewer economic opportunities than men. The jobs available to women paid significantly less than men's work, and many women had no legal right to control their own earnings. Married women's wages belonged to their husbands, and single women were often excluded from better-paying occupations. Economic boom and bust cycles were extreme and unpredictable. A town might explode in population and prosperity when ore was discovered or a railroad arrived, then become a ghost town within months when the ore played out or the railroad moved on. People who invested in property or businesses during boom times often lost everything when the inevitable bust followed. The lack of economic diversity meant that entire communities depended on single industries or employers. When mines closed, ranchers failed, or other economic anchors disappeared, whole towns could become worthless overnight. People often had to abandon their homes and possessions to search for work elsewhere. Retirement was not a realistic concept for most frontier residents. People worked until they died, became too disabled to continue, or found family members willing to support them. Social safety nets didn't exist, and old age was often synonymous with poverty and neglect. The irony of frontier economics was that the harder people worked, the poorer they often became. The physical demands of frontier life aged workers rapidly, reducing their earning capacity just as their expenses for medical care and basic survival increased. Many people who came west seeking economic opportunity found only poverty, hardship, and early death. Yet people continued to come, drawn by stories of success and the belief that they would be among the lucky few who managed to prosper. The American dream was born on the frontier, but for most people, it remained just that, a dream that sustained them through lives of grinding poverty and endless toil. Chapter 13. The Outlaw Life, or How Crime Doesn't Pay, but Neither Does Anything Else. The romanticized image of frontier outlaws as charming rogues, living free and easy lives, is perhaps the greatest fiction ever created about the American West. Real outlaws lived short, brutal lives filled with violence, poverty, paranoia, and usually ending in death by gunshot, hanging, or disease in some forgotten corner of the wilderness. Becoming an outlaw was often less a career choice than a result of circumstances beyond control. Many men turned to crime because legitimate work was unavailable, underpaid, or impossibly dangerous. Others became outlaws accidentally through self-defense killings, business disputes that turned violent, or simply being in the wrong place when law enforcement needed someone to blame for local crimes. The daily life of an outlaw was anything but glamorous. They lived rough, sleeping outdoors in all weather, eating whatever they could hunt, steal, or scavenge. They couldn't stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, or visit towns without risking recognition and capture. Most of their time was spent hiding in remote areas that were uncomfortable, dangerous, and far from civilization. Planning and executing robberies required skills that most outlaws didn't possess. Bank robberies were rare because banks were heavily defended and usually contained. Less money than the risks would justify. Train robberies were more common but extremely dangerous, as railroad companies hired armed guards and pursued robbers with posses and professional trackers. Most outlaw gangs were small, poorly organized groups of desperate men who trusted no one, including each other. Internal conflicts were common, and many outlaws were killed by their own gang members over disputes about money, leadership, or women. Loyalty was rare in a profession where survival depended on being willing to sacrifice anyone for personal advantage. The amounts of money stolen were usually much smaller than legend suggests. A typical stagecoach might contain a few $100, barely enough to split among several gang members after expenses. Banks often had less cash on hand than outlaws expected, and much of what they did steal was in forms that were difficult to convert to usable currency. Spending stolen money was nearly impossible without attracting attention. Large purchases or sudden displays of wealth would alert law enforcement, so most outlaws remained poor despite their criminal activities. They often had to fence stolen goods at fractions of their value, and finding trustworthy buyers was dangerous and difficult. Law enforcement pursued outlaws with determination and resources that made capture almost inevitable. Federal marshals, Pinkerton detectives, and local posses tracked outlaws across vast distances, often for months or years. The telegraph allowed law enforcement to coordinate efforts and share information rapidly, making it increasingly difficult for outlaws to find safe havens. Bounties on outlaws. Heads created an army of bounty hunters who tracked criminals for profit. These men were often as dangerous and ruthless as the outlaws they pursued, and they had the advantage of operating within the law. Bounty hunters could go places and use methods that were forbidden to official law enforcement. The constant stress of being hunted took a severe psychological toll on outlaws. They lived in fear of betrayal, capture, and violent death. Paranoia was a survival skill, but it made normal human relationships impossible. Many outlaws died alone, abandoned by friends and family who couldn't afford to be associated with wanted criminals. Medical care was unavailable to outlaws who couldn't risk visiting doctors or hospitals. Wounds became infected, diseases went untreated, and many outlaws died from medical conditions that would have been easily treatable if they could have sought help. Dental problems, in particular, caused constant agony that drove some outlaws to desperate acts. Women associated with outlaws lived even more dangerous lives than the men. They were often abandoned when the gang moved on, left to face the consequences of their associations alone. Some women became outlaws themselves, but they faced additional dangers and had even fewer options for survival. The most successful outlaws were those who quit early and disappeared into legitimate occupations under assumed names. Those who continued in crime usually died young and violently. The average career of a professional outlaw was measured in months rather than years. Jesse James, perhaps the most famous outlaw of the era, was shot in the back by a member of his own gang who wanted to collect the bounty on his head. Billy the Kid was gunned down by a sheriff in a dark room. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid fled to South America, where they probably died in a shootout with Bolivian soldiers. These were not glamorous endings to romantic careers. Most outlaws were forgotten quickly after their deaths. Only a few became legendary, and their legends were largely created by dime novels and later Hollywood movies that bore little resemblance to the harsh realities of criminal life on the frontier. The truth about outlaw life was that it offered all the dangers and hardships of legitimate frontier occupations with the added risks of being hunted by law enforcement and betrayed by associates. It was a profession with low pay, terrible working conditions, no job security, and a retirement plan that usually involved a shallow grave in unmarked wilderness. Chapter 14. Boom. Towns and Ghost Towns, or How to Build a Community That Dies. Before you do, frontier towns had a life cycle that was often shorter than the average human lifespan. They exploded into existence overnight, reached peak prosperity within months, and then died just as quickly when the economic conditions that created them disappeared. Understanding this cycle is crucial to grasping the temporary, desperate nature of frontier life. The birth of a boomtown usually began with a discovery: gold, silver, oil, or sometimes just a reliable water source in an otherwise barren landscape. Word would spread with remarkable speed, often exaggerated beyond all recognition by the time it reached distant cities. Men would abandon jobs, families, and established lives to rush toward the promise of instant wealth. The first arrivals at a new boom site lived in tents, caves, or crude shelters thrown together from whatever materials they could find. There were no roads, no infrastructure, and no established supply lines. Everything had to be improvised, and the results were usually temporary structures that looked like they'd been built by drunk children with access to scrap lumber. As word spread and more people arrived, entrepreneurs would follow to provide goods and services to the growing population. The first businesses were usually saloons, gambling halls, and supply stores. because these met the most immediate needs of men who were far from home, working under terrible conditions and earning irregular incomes. Building materials had to be hauled enormous distances over primitive trails, making construction expensive and slow. Most boomtown buildings were thrown together quickly with minimal attention to quality or permanence. Fire was a constant threat because buildings were made of dry wood, lit by open flames, and often occupied by drunk men with poor judgment. Streets were rarely planned and never paved. They were muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry weather, and always filled with refuse, animal waste, and the debris of rapid construction. Sanitation was non-existent, and disease spread rapidly through crowded, unsanitary conditions. The peak period of a boomtown was frantic and chaotic. Money flowed freely but unpredictably. Fortunes were made and lost daily through gambling, speculation, and business ventures that were often more hope than substance. Prices for everything were inflated far beyond reasonable levels, but people paid them because they expected to strike it rich tomorrow. Competition for resources was fierce and often violent. Water rights, mining claims, and business locations were disputed constantly, and these disputes were usually settled through force rather than legal proceedings. Men who had been friends in the morning might be shooting at each other by evening over a disagreement about claim boundaries. The social structure of boomtowns was fluid and dangerous. Traditional hierarchies didn't exist, and status was determined by recent success, current wealth, or the ability to intimidate others. Men who had been laborers back east might become wealthy overnight, while former business owners found themselves working for daily wages. Women were scarce in boomtowns, and those who did come were usually there for business rather than domestic reasons. Prostitutes, dancehall girls, and female entrepreneurs could make substantial money in boomtowns, but they lived dangerous lives in violent, unstable communities where legal protection was minimal. Law enforcement was often absent or ineffective during boom periods. The rapid growth and transient population made it difficult to establish stable institutions, and many boom towns went through multiple sheriffs, mayors, and other officials as the original appointees were killed, driven out, or simply abandoned their posts. The bust phase of boomtowns was often as rapid as the boom. When the ore played out, the oil dried up, or the economic opportunity disappeared. People left as quickly as they had arrived. Businesses closed overnight, buildings were abandoned, and entire communities became ghost towns within months. The transition from boom to bust was usually marked by increasing violence and desperation. As legitimate opportunities disappeared, people turned to crime, fraud, and other desperate measures to maintain their incomes. The last residents of dying boomtowns were often the most dangerous, as they had the least to lose and the most reason to take risks. Ghost towns were littered across the frontier landscape like the skeletons of failed dreams. Buildings stood empty with windows broken and roofs collapsed. Personal possessions were scattered in the streets, abandoned when their owners fled. The silence was oppressive, broken only by wind whistling through empty structures. Some boom towns managed to transition to more stable economies and survived as permanent communities. These were the exceptions rather than the rule. Most boom towns died completely, leaving only ruins to mark where thousands of people had once lived, worked, and hoped for better lives. The psychological impact of boomtown life was severe. People lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing whether their current prosperity would last another day or another year. The stress of rapid change, intense competition, and ever-present danger took a heavy toll on mental and physical health. Children who grew up in boomtowns often had disrupted education and unstable home lives. Families were frequently separated. When boomtowns died and people scattered to find new opportunities, many children lost contact with their parents permanently during these mass migrations. The environmental impact of boomtowns was devastating and permanent. Mining operations stripped landscapes bare, poisoned water sources, and left behind toxic waste that contaminated the land for generations. The scars left by 19th-century boomtowns are still visible today in many parts of the American West. Chapter 15: Native American Relations, or How to Inherit Someone Else's War. The relationship between frontier settlers and Native American tribes was complex, violent, and tragic for all involved. Popular culture has reduced this relationship to simple stereotypes of cowboys versus Indians, but the reality was far more complicated and infinitely more brutal than Hollywood Westerns suggest. By the time most settlers reached the frontier, the conflict between European-descended Americans and native tribes had been ongoing for more than 2 centuries. New arrivals inherited a situation that was already characterized by mutual mistrust, competing claims to land and resources, and a cycle of violence that fed on itself. Different Native American tribes had vastly different relationships with white settlers. Some tribes had been trading partners and allies for generations, while others had been fighting a desperate war of survival against encroachment on their traditional lands. Settlers often couldn't distinguish between friendly and hostile tribes, leading to tragic misunderstandings and unnecessary violence. The U.S. government's policy toward Native Americans was inconsistent, often contradictory, and usually ignored by frontier settlers who felt they were too far from Washington to worry about official policy. Treaties were signed and broken regularly, promises were made and forgotten, and legal agreements were ignored when they became inconvenient. Many settlers genuinely wanted to live peacefully with Native American neighbors, but the economic and social pressures of frontier life made this difficult. Competition for land, water, and resources created conflicts that were often resolved through violence. Cultural misunderstandings led to incidents that escalated into broader conflicts. The U.S. Army was supposed to maintain peace between settlers and native tribes, but it was understaffed, poorly equipped, and often sympathetic to settlers rather than neutral between the parties. Army posts were scattered across vast territories, and help was often days or weeks away when conflicts erupted. Raids and counter-raids created a cycle of violence that was difficult to break. Native warriors would attack isolated settlements, kill settlers, and steal livestock or supplies. Settlers would retaliate by attacking native villagers, often killing women and children along with warriors. Each attack justified the next, and the violence escalated steadily. The arrival of large numbers of settlers disrupted traditional Native American ways of life, even when direct conflict was avoided. Buffalo herds were slaughtered for hides and sport, leaving plains tribes without their primary source of food, clothing, and shelter. Traditional hunting grounds were claimed by settlers and converted to farms or ranches. Disease was perhaps the most devastating weapon in the conquest of Native America, though it was rarely used intentionally. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other European diseases swept through native populations that had no immunity to these illnesses. Entire tribes were wiped out by epidemics, leaving their lands empty for settler occupation. Some Native Americans adapted to the changing conditions by adopting European-style agriculture, education, and government. These attempts at accommodation were often unsuccessful because white settlers wanted the land regardless of how it was being used, and they were unwilling to accept Native Americans as permanent neighbors. The reservation system was designed to remove native tribes from lands wanted by settlers, but it was implemented poorly and often ignored. Reservations were usually located on land that was unsuitable for agriculture or too remote to be economically viable. Many reservations lacked adequate water, food, or other necessities for survival. Government agents responsible for managing reservations were often corrupt, incompetent, or both. Supplies that were supposed to be provided to reservation inhabitants were frequently stolen, sold, or simply never delivered. Native Americans on reservations often faced starvation, while government officials became wealthy from embezzling funds. Intended for tribal welfare, the Indian Wars were not a single conflict, but a series of localized wars that lasted for decades. Some were triggered by specific incidents, while others were the result of long-standing tensions that finally erupted into open warfare. The wars were characterized by extreme brutality on both sides, with civilians often targeted deliberately. Scalping, torture, and mutilation of enemies were practiced by both Native Americans and white settlers. These practices were often exaggerated in contemporary accounts and later popular culture, but they did occur and contributed to the atmosphere of fear and hatred that characterized frontier warfare. Many settlers lived in constant fear of Native American attacks, even in areas where such attacks were rare or non-existent. This fear influenced every aspect of frontier life, from the location of settlements to daily work routines. Children were taught to hide at the first sign of danger, and adults rarely traveled alone or unarmed. The impact of frontier warfare on Native American societies was catastrophic. Traditional leadership structures were disrupted, cultural practices were suppressed, and entire tribes were relocated far from their ancestral homes. The psychological trauma of conquest and displacement affected generations of Native Americans. Some white settlers developed genuine respect and affection for Native American neighbors, and some Native Americans found ways to coexist peacefully with white communities. These positive relationships were often overlooked in accounts that focused on conflict and violence, but they did exist and provided models for what might have been possible under different circumstances. The tragedy of Native American relations on the frontier was that peaceful coexistence was probably possible, but was prevented by larger economic and political forces that neither settlers nor Native Americans could control. Both groups were caught up in historical processes that were bigger than their individual choices and desires. Chapter 16. The End of Your Frontier. Day or How to Almost Survive Until Tomorrow, as the sun sets on another day in your frontier. Existence assuming you've managed to survive this long without being shot, poisoned, trampled, diseased, or bankrupted, you face the challenge of preparing for another night in a place where sleep offers no guarantee of safety and morning brings no promise of improvement. Your evening meal, if you're fortunate enough to have one, consists of the same unappetizing fare that has sustained you throughout the day. More beans, perhaps accompanied by hardtack that's been softened in whatever liquid was available, coffee, whiskey, or that brownish substance that passes for water in your community. If you're particularly lucky, there might be a piece of jerky that's only slightly rancid, or some canned goods that haven't yet developed the telltale bulge that indicates lethal contamination. The act of eating is complicated by the fact that your dining companions, assuming you have any, are likely armed, drunk, or both. Conversations tend toward topics that might lead to violence, politics, women, money, or the relative merits of different firearms. Smart diners eat quickly and keep their hands visible at all times. Because misunderstandings over dinner have ended more frontier careers than all the gunfights combined. After your meal, you face the social dilemma of how to spend your evening. Hours? The saloon beckons with its promise of alcohol, companionship, and entertainment. But it also offers excellent opportunities for losing your money, your dignity, or your life. The games are rigged, the women are expensive, and the other patrons are desperate men with weapons and poor judgment. If you choose to gamble, you're entering a world where cheating is expected, disputes are settled with violence, and winning too much is often more dangerous than losing everything. Professional gamblers move through frontier towns like sharks through bloody water, and they've perfected techniques for separating marks from their money that are both subtle and effective. The alternative to the saloon is returning to your lodgings, which may consist of a shared room in a boarding house, a space on the floor of a bunkhouse, or a tent that offers minimal protection from weather, insects, and human predators. Privacy is non-existent, security is minimal, and comfort is a luxury that few can afford. Your sleeping arrangements are likely to be communal, with multiple men sharing beds, floors, or whatever flat surfaces are available. Your bunkmates may be strangers who arrived that day, long-time residents who've developed antisocial habits, or individuals whose personal hygiene makes close quarters particularly challenging. Snoring, coughing, and various other bodily functions create a symphony of sounds that make rest difficult even when external threats don't. The building itself offers limited protection from the elements or from human threats. Walls are thin, locks are weak or non-existent, and windows are often just openings covered with cloth or paper. Fire is a constant danger because heating and lighting involve open flames in structures built from dry wood with minimal attention to safety. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and frequently interrupted. Every sound might indicate danger: footsteps on creaky floorboards, voices arguing in the street, the crack of gunfire from the saloon district, or simply the wind rattling loose boards. Many frontier residents developed the ability to sleep lightly while remaining alert to potential threats, a skill that was essential for survival but destructive to long-term health.